We're talking about shading today, and when it comes to shading, there's two different things that you have to be worried about or concerned about, and I'm going to talk about both of them. But the idea is that there's two different kinds of shading, and 100% of the time that you're drawing, those two things are combined. But I only want to focus on one of them right now. So in order to have my drawing not be misunderstood, I have to explain it. So there's two different kinds of shading. One is rendering, where we have an object and we're trying to make it look round. And that's what we're primarily focused on today. The other aspect of shading is organizational shading. And that's to say, like, this is an apple. Okay? How dark is the apple compared to the table? How dark is the shadow compared to the shadow on the apple or the light part of the apple? How dark is the shadow compared to the table? Organizational shading is about those comparisons. You can't really separate the two, but for the purposes of our video, I'm going to leave the background white because the table that I have the apple on is very light. The apple itself is yellow, which makes it relatively light, but it's darker than the table. And then I have the shadow areas that are going to be even darker. So I've set up a situation where I can have a white background and it'll actually work. When we start making drawings for real and they're not just studies, you're not going to be able to do that. Everything is going to get charcoal on some level. There'll be like one white spot in your drawing and everything else will get some charcoal on it. So, okay. So now what I'm doing is I'm just working out the contour drawing for my apple. And I want to take a minute and be as specific as I can and make sure that I'm happy with it. I'm using vine charcoal, and vine charcoal comes in a bunch of different forms. This is one big stick that broke a while back. I like these big ones. It seems like you couldn't possibly do anything precise with them, but you can actually. I'm going to use this slightly smaller broken piece. I'm going to work up the big values that I know I need in vine, and then I'm going to switch to the pencils. So just working out the big contour drawing very lightly, because ultimately these are lines that we're not going to need. And that's another important thing about shading that we're going to get to. Now the thing about vine charcoal is that it is messy, but it comes right off. You can erase it with your fingers, and that is the best thing about it. It gives you total control over where you want to have charcoal and where you don't. Okay, so when you go to talk about organizational shading, the first thing that you do once you've got your contour drawing in is now you have to decide where your big lights and darks are. And so my table is light. My apple is a light yellow, so I'm going to put a little bit of charcoal on it. And then the cast shadow is generally darker. And it doesn't really matter how you go about putting your charcoal on. It's just at the beginning you don't want to go too dark. So value is, shading is built up over time. Now while I'm doing my shading, I just used the word value, and value refers to the lightness or darkness of a shape, a line, whatever. It doesn't really matter what we're talking about. Its value is its lightness or darkness. Now I'm right-handed, so when I make these hatch marks, they tend to go top right to top left, but you can make them any direction you want. I just tend, when I'm trying to draw quickly, I tend to draw with angles in this direction, but it's not really going to matter ultimately. You'll see me changing direction quite a bit. Now I know that my highlight, that lightest part of the apple, is right there. And there's another one, it looks like right there. And I'm just going to draw around those for a minute. And I'm not really doing anything specific here. I'm just trying to make sure that the shadow on the table, the cast shadow, is darker in general than the apple here. And I'm noticing that there's a little bit of a change here. The shadow gets a little bit lighter as it goes that way. Okay, so light's coming in from this direction. This is the part of the apple that's lighter. The dark part of the apple has a couple different components that we're going to go into. But if light's coming in this way, this part's in direct light. This is the shadow part of the apple. That's the cast shadow. A lot of people use what's referred to as a 6-value scale for rendering an object. And I'm going to simplify that for now. So what I want to do is sort of label for you guys, while we're talking, the main components of what you're going to be seeing here. And the cast shadow is one of the main components. So the cast shadow always has a hard edge. So this, what I mean by that is the edge here needs to be sharp. Now what happens is it's like where the object is closest to the shadow, it starts out super sharp, and as it gets further away, it will soften on the edge a little bit. But that a characteristic of a cast shadow is its hardness on the edge. The shadow that's going to go right here, that I'm going to strengthen a little bit, just give me a second to work it in. Okay, so the dark part of the apple itself, the part that's in the dark, is referred to as the core shadow. Now, we can say that the core shadow is the whole dark area, but really the core shadow has two parts. The core shadow is the soft, dark part on the edge of the shadow. Inside the shadow, there'll be a reflection. So we have direct light. We have the direct light area. The highlight is one of your values. The core shadow, the reflection, and the cast shadow. Those are the main, that's as simple as I can break it down just in terms of making sure we get all the rendering right. Now what we do, since we're organized as far as this guy goes, we can switch over to our pencils and get a lot more specific. And one of the things that we want to be doing is we want to slowly start to eliminate the line that's on the edge. Now sometimes there'll be a sharp edge and it'll be kind of dark on the edge, but you just don't want there to be a line there. And I'll show you what I mean by that. And the first thing I do when I go to show you that is draw a line, but hopefully that will, I'll be able to explain it as we go. But when you're shading, the worst thing you can do is to go too dark, too fast. So I sped up the film here just so that the video would be a little bit shorter. It's a absurdly long video for the rendering of a single apple. But anyway, I have the work that's being done here in charcoal pencil. You know, it's all sped up so you really can't see the details. But using a charcoal pencil, we all kind of already know how to do it. There might be some other techniques and different types of hatching or directional mark making we can start to play around with later. But for now, just draw lightly and build up the value slowly, and you'll gain a level of control over it that you'll be happy with. The shading part of drawing there's not that much information. You know, I went over the vast majority of the information that you need to know about shading already in this video. When we go and do another one about organizational shading, most of that is just experience. There isn't a lot of information. It's observation and experience. So in this video, there's another 30 seconds or so of drawing, and then I'll come back in and review all the important information and go back to real time. A couple key things. Light's coming in this way. All this information here is direct light. There's a highlight, there's a couple transitional values in between, but the main part is that you have a highlight, you just observe what's going on through here. When you get to here, this is the darkest part of the object. The stem doesn't count, we're just talking about the volume. This is the darkest part on the object. You never want the edge to be the darkest. This part needs to be a little bit darker and stay soft. It's always transitional. If you have something like an apple, that shadow is going to change all the way down. If you're painting like a bowling ball that's a perfect sphere, the core shadow is going to be very even and regular, but here it's going to vary. When you go to draw something like fabric, you're trying to render that, that's going to be something that's going to vary quite a lot too. So here we have the cast shadow. It's nice and sharp. It's a little bit darker in here. The reason it gets a little bit lighter, and sometimes it won't, but in this case, there's a lot of light bouncing around the table that I'm looking at. It's darker down here. It gets a little bit lighter, but it's a transition. But the edge is sharp. That's the key. Inside the core shadow, you have what's called reflected light. Reflected light is, in a lot of ways, where a lot of the action's going to be. That's where you just have to observe it. It's going to be crazy all the time. It just depends on what's around. But in this case, most of it is right through here. There's even a little bit outside here. And we're seeing it where there's definitely some up through here. But since this area is dark against a light background, and this area is dark against a dark background, there's a lot more subtlety here. This edge is an overlap, so it needs to stay sharp. But notice how I built up the sharpness, but I didn't allow a line to form. It's sharp on the outside and soft on the inside, so it transitions in. The information on the object needs to be all about transition and softness. And the overlaps and the shadows are all about sharpness. And one of the things that will become true later is that there's 3 reasons in your drawing why you would have a hard edge. and I'm probably going to make an edges video, but I'll talk about it here. You have an overlapping mass makes a hard edge, a cast shadow makes a hard edge, and an abrupt change in plane will make a hard edge. We don't have any of those in an apple. And then there are varying degrees of that. But that's the big stuff that you need to remember about rendering. We'll talk more about organizational shading and combining those things a little bit more as we go.